CBS News Philadelphia, Pennsylvania's Attorney General is announcing arrests in multiple child sexual abuse cases across the state. Let's listen in.
Ongoing investigation against multiple men across Pennsylvania for sexually assaulting children. Sadly, this is not the first time that I've stood here and talked about this. Last October, our office announced similar charges against 5 separate men. And then in February, I stood before you and announced charges against 4 additional men. This is the 3rd press conference of this nature, which we've held in 3 different areas of the Commonwealth. As I said, this abuse happened across the Commonwealth. Since last fall, we have charged 14 individuals connected to the same religious organization, the Jehovah Witnesses, as part of this ongoing investigation into child sexual abuse. Of those 14 that we previously arrested, all of them are pending trial, and their cases are at different points in the criminal justice system, but for one individual who took his own life when our agents were attempting to apprehend him. As I have said before, the details of these cases that I will be talking about are incredibly disturbing. The 5 defendants that we have charged today were all adults in positions of trust with these victims. And they violated that trust and they abused these children. Children are some of our most vulnerable members of society, and they should be nurtured and protected. But instead of protecting these children, the defendants violated and abused them. I can assure you that my office remains steadfast in the commitment to investigate, prosecute, and hold accountable individuals that prey on children. And while these 5 cases have their own set of facts and circumstances and different victims, there are common factors. All 5 men had the trust of the victims and their families. And all 5 men were members of the Jehovah Witness congregation, and many of them gained access to their victims through this organization. These cases were presented to an investigative grand jury, and the grand jurors heard the evidence, they heard testimony, they considered and weighed it, and they made a recommendation to charge all 5 defendants. I'm going to go through the details now of each individual case. First, David Belosa, 62, of Philadelphia. It is alleged that this defendant sexually assaulted a young girl whom he had met through the Jehovah Witnesses community when she was 4 years old and he was 35. He became close to the victim's family and his congregation after moving to the United States. The victim's family welcomed him. They even let him stay in their home. And that is how he got to know the victim. The victim became friendly with him. And one evening, she went down to the basement to visit with him. And when she did that, he took that opportunity to pull her onto his lap and sexually abuse her. Before she went up from the basement, he told her not to tell anyone. He's been charged with aggravated indecent assault indecent assault, and corruption of minors. The second case, Earl William Hall, 50 years old, of Alden, Delaware County. Hall, who was 41 years old at the time, was an elder in the Jehovah Witness congregation. Through his position of authority and trust, he became close with his victim, a 16-year-old girl. Hall would often give this young victim a ride to and from school. On numerous occasions, he inappropriately touched her without her consent. Hall has been charged with indecent assault and corruption of minors. The third case is Sean Sheffer, 45, of Butler County. In that case, the grand jurors heard testimony describing Sheffer's sexual assault of a young girl who was just 7 years old when the abuse started. He was 18 at the time. Sheffer had a familial relationship with this victim and often was alone with her in her home without her parents' supervision. It was during these times that he repeatedly raped and assaulted this young girl. The victim testified that the defendant raped her 50 to 75 times till she was 12 years old. He has been charged with rape, involuntary deviant sexual intercourse, aggravated indecent assault, and corruptions of minors. The next case is Terry Booth, 57 years old, of Panama City, Florida. Through a Jehovah Witness congregation in Allegheny County, Booth became a mentor to a 16-year-old boy who ultimately turned out to be his victim. Through this mentorship, he spent extended periods of time alone with the boy, during which time he groomed his victim. He was 44 at the time, and he was engaging this victim in inappropriate sexual conversations. And on at least one occasion, that conduct escalated into inappropriate touching without the victim's consent. Booth is charged with indecent assault and corruption of minors. Finally, Luis Ala Velezda, 55, of Reading. He abused a young family member of his for several years, beginning when she was 12 years old and he was 34. The grand jury heard testimony from the victim, who stated that for years he would sneak into her bedroom while she was sleeping and sexually assault her. Years later, when the victim was an adult, he raped her again in his home. He has been charged with rape, involuntary deviant sexual intercourse, aggravated indecent assault, endangering the welfare of children, and corruption of minors. I have to say that I am thankful to the courageous survivors involved in these cases who were willing to share the horrific abuse that they went through. I'm inspired by their strength. Many of these incidents and offenses happened a long time ago, even decades ago. But as a longtime child abuse prosecutor, I can tell you that the trauma endures for these victims. And for these survivors to have the courage and the willingness to pursue justice against their abusers is truly brave and remarkable. Recounting these events surely was not easy, and the process will not be easy. The Office of Attorney General and the victim support will be there. I also want to thank the grand jurors. We appreciate the service of the independent citizens who make up the grand jury. They participate in the process, and in this case, they reviewed all the evidence, they heard painful testimony, and they reached their own determination about the evidence and returned these charges. And of course, I would like to thank the Office of Attorney General and the incredibly talented team that worked on this case. Executive Deputy Attorney General Michelle Walsh, who is with me, Chief Deputy Attorney General Ron Eisenberg, Chief Deputy Attorney General Chris Jones, Special Agent Jimmy Mamua, Steve Adams, and Christina Hinkston. They're here behind me, and they have done extraordinary work. I would also like to give a special thanks to our partners in law enforcement, the Bay County Sheriff's Office, and the U.S. Marshals who assisted us in the apprehension of the individuals. I will say that this office will never stop working to bring justice to those who have been victimized. And we will continue to investigate and prosecute anyone who harms the most vulnerable members of our community. Finally, I would like to thank the members of the media that are here today and have been here for covering these allegations and shedding more light on the horrors of child sexual abuse in this community. After the previous press coverage from the announcements that I had talked about earlier, victims came forward and shared their stories. So getting the word out is incredibly important. And so in closing, I am asking anyone with information regarding allegations of sexual assault related to this case, please contact our office. Our hotline is 888-538-8541. Please reach out. These tips can make a world of difference. Thank you.
Madam Attorney General, what do you know about what the Jehovah Witness leadership knows about this problem within its ranks?
What I can tell you, and I've discussed the prior announcements that we've made, that in these cases, and obviously that's the focus, we've charged 14 individuals. All of them, at the time of the sexual assaults, were Jehovah Witnesses, and many of them gained access to their victims through this. These cases are ongoing.
Is there a special investigative effort by the Attorney General's office that's focused on Jehovah's Witnesses? And if so, was it kicked off by the victims coming forward, or did you find the victims as part of that initial investigation?
This case came to us as a resource referral, and it's an ongoing investigation involving child abuse.
Are any of these cases like these 14 cases that you prosecuted over the last few months?
I'm sorry, I missed the beginning.
Are any of those cases linked? You said there's 14 from the Jehovah's Witness Church, and then these 5 also from the Jehovah's Witness Church. So are any of them linked?
Well, in terms of these cases are all separate cases. In other words, in these situations, in all the cases that we've announced, we've arrested individuals, we've arrested men who have preyed on children and sexually abused them. They're separate and distinct. There is a common thread that I've mentioned. One is the gaining of trust of the victims. The second is that they all were Jehovah Witnesses and part of the congregation at the time of the abuse and gained access to the victims through that.
Is there anything in your investigation that's showing a problem with culture, like we experience in the Roman Catholic Church with priests? Is there anything that's showing that it reaches that extent?
Look, I can't talk beyond what we've discussed today and in the previous cases. I do encourage you, as I said, I went over these cases in very brief detail. I encourage you to look at the presentments.
I'll just ask you, do you have any evidence that the Jehovah Witness, as an organization, as a church organization, has met with any of the families, offered payment or counseling in the same way that the Catholic Church has?
I can't comment on that.
Yeah, so you ended your statement saying that, or offering a number to call for more victims. Do you expect more victims to come forward?
Well, if history teaches us anything, yes.
Did you mention that the first victim was an immigrant? Where the child from?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
I'm sorry. The first victim, you mentioned that was an immigrant, right? What country was from the family?
You may have misunderstood. The defendant in that case came from another country to the United States. Sure.
Would there be an investigation or report done on the church itself?
I can't comment on that at this time.
Did any of these victims come forward at the time of the abuse, and was there a cover-up or a blind eye turned on behalf, by the church hierarchy?
Look, I can't comment on that beyond the detail that's contained in the presentments.
Are any of these cases from the same congregation, the same church?
I don't believe so, no.
Do you know whether any of these folks who you've charged here, do they know each other?
I don't know that.
So all of these 5 here, you bring these cases because the victims step forward in every single case.
Look, some of the cases we've had victims come forward, and some, as I mentioned, came as a result of our press conferences and talking about these cases. In other cases, we've obviously been looking at a variety of different types of evidence and have uncovered some of this abuse that way.
Does it seem like more people are starting to be more comfortable with stepping forward and sharing what happened to them? Because when we hear all the press conferences, you ask the question, is it happening more often, or are people stepping forward more often?
That's a great question. I truly believe that victims become more comfortable coming forward when they know they're not alone. So that's true of, I think, any cases of child abuse.
But again, on these 5 cases, though, were they all generated from the prior press of your prior cases?
Not all of them, no.
Last question?
I was talking to somebody recently just about religion, and all we would ever hear about is the cases against the Catholic priests. But they mentioned that this obviously happens in all kinds of faith. Can you talk about just the the grooming that faith leaders or people of this group do to find their victims, get their victims?
Look, I can just say generally, as a longtime child abuse prosecutor, unfortunately, this exists everywhere. And one of the key pieces to child abuse is that the offenders have to have access to their victims. They have to have a way in order to get to them and groom them. And so there's a variety of umbrellas that can fall under. And unfortunately, religious organizations is one of them, but certainly not the only one. Thank you. Oh, sorry.
The 5 cases, I remember you mentioned one is an elder. Is the other 4, are they just member of the church, or do they hold any positions in the church in the other 4 cases?
They're just members.
Yeah, they're just members.
Yeah. The other 4 were just members. And again, I would encourage you to read the presentments. There's a little bit more detail than I've had time to. But thank you all for coming, and I appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Madam Attorney, you've arrested all these folks?
That are designed to separate us from Jehovah's organization. As an example, think about the apostate-driven lies and dishonesties that Jehovah's organization is permissive toward pedophiles. I mean, that is ridiculous, isn't it? If anybody takes action against someone who would threaten our young ones and takes action to protect our young ones, it's Jehovah's organization. We reject outright such lies.
Okay. Now, we'll see what we have to turn off. There. No? Now it's working.
Okay, if I just said yay, so.
But there's an echo. Now it's working?
I don't see.
How's it working now?
Are you on the screen?
Okay. Now is it working? I think it's working.
We can hear you, and now it's on.
Yeah. Now it's working. Yeah, I had it doing a few things here, so I just reloaded the mic. I think it's all
We can
good.
hear you now, but echoing.
Yeah, it was echoing now, so now it should be good. So just stay here and let me know.
Yep.
But anyways, I'm gonna carry on. Sorry about the show here. I kind of had my
You're not on the screen.
studio upside down here, so I should be on the screen. You guys should see me. So yeah, that was getting back to the whole news, the breaking news article. That was, I had to have my Kleenex out for that one. It was when we hear about these things, it's really hard to listen to them. And if you've been involved in any CSA, now's the time to actually come out and talk about it. And don't talk to us about it, talk to a lawyer. Very important. The less you, if you're going to go for legal, take the legal course, which I think everyone should, then you talk to your lawyer or find a lawyer and talk to them. And then the lawyer, and that's a way of getting it out, is therapy in itself, because you talk to the lawyer. And they have, the lawyers all have good therapists type people, professionals that work for them. So yes, if you are involved in any of this from, doesn't matter if it was when, a long time ago and you're old, doesn't matter. Talk to a lawyer, don't share it online, because that could work against you, okay? So that's it. You probably hear the birds in the background. I have the door open in my shop. It's summertime here. It's beautiful out. So, and I get really good reception here. So thanks for for bearing with me on the show here. And we have some interesting stuff coming up. We have we're going to be talking about well, we're gonna actually be going into some courtroom scenarios here, and that's what today's thing was about. What happens in court, and if you're let's say you're going to go for CSA charges, you're wondering what goes on in court. Well, every court's different, but the next couple of videos is designed to help us if we're victims as we go through this thing. Now I'm going to share some of my screens with you here. Let's look at this one. Now, we'll go to the YouTube screen here. On the YouTube screen, we've been, where are we here? Just looking at some of the videos, shorts, and our playlists. So right now we're on live on our video here. But on our videos, the last little bit, you'll notice we've been covering topics like this, the two-witness rule of the Jehovah's Witness organization. And this is what gets Jehovah's Witness organization into a lot of trouble with these cases, is this two-witness rule. And we really dove into that to discover that it's not even biblically based. So if you want to know more about that, just go back to our playlist or go back to our lives, and you can see a lot of this happening. So this is a hot topic. It's all over the news, all over the world. It's the worst advertising that Jehovah's Witnesses could get. Now we're going to move over to back to here. We're going to move over to Thera mind trees. People who don't want you to think are never your friend. So I don't know if you heard of this, Thera mind trees. But Thera mind trees, this is a site. We emailed them. Now, we want to thank Marmy. Did I get that right? My good wife will let us all know. Put a big thank you to Marmy if she's online. And a lot of this information comes from you guys. So if you have some really good sites, good information, you think the community should know about it, send us a link. We'll look at it. And if it fits our program, we'll run it. And what we do is we like to email these guys. So we emailed these guys. They got right back to us. And they said, yes, by all means, I can use. I told them when I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it tonight. And we're going to run a part 1, part 2. These people put a lot of work into their videos. Now, Thera Trees, they have 306,000 subscribers, 63 videos. It's an adult-oriented channel that explores issues around abuse, manipulation, dogma, and systems of undue influence. And for over 15 years, the subjects and themes of the work have been shaped organically in response to the ongoing correspondence. And I think it's a she, I'm not sure, but it says, I do not have Twitter or Facebook, blah, blah, blah. And you can go to her site and you can get a hold of her. But she was really good about emailing us back. So thank you very much to Thera Trees. We're going to get right into this program because you guys have all been waiting for it. And it's right here on the site, Exposing Abuse, Jehovah's Witnesses on Trial. So think about all the work that went into this. And I think these guys are out of the UK. Where are they out of? United Kingdom. So they're out of the United Kingdom, this company that put this all together, and it's professionally done. And so we're going to take a look at part 1. We're going to get right into it here. And I want to pause it here. And I'm going to blow it up. I'm going to go to my other screen here. And there, we got her on the little screen there. So.
In November 2012, Australian ex-Prime Minister Julia Gillard proposed a royal commission to investigate institutional responses to child sexual abuse. It covered a range of institutions, including schools, churches, and sports clubs, in a total of 57 public hearings, recording the testimonies of nearly 7,000 abused individuals, around 64% of whom were male, and 10% of whom said it was the first time they'd told anyone about their abuse. There would be testimonies from people like Hugh, who was abused around age 10 by a scout leader, who, after gaining his parents' trust, had him over for parties where boys were plied with marijuana and alcohol and molested. And like Margaret, who was 11 when she was abused at a Salvation Army children's home by a church captain who not only molested children but orchestrated their abuse of each other. To conduct the Commission's investigation, a panel of 6 commissioners was appointed, headed by Justice Peter McClellan, a former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of New South Wales and Assistant Commissioner for the Independent Commission Against Corruption. In May 2015, the Commission began to investigate Case 29 of their public hearings which concerned responses to child sexual abuse within the Jehovah's Witness organization. Assisting counsel for the commission was the formidable Angus Stewart QC. In a video called Concealing Abuse, I looked at how the Jehovah's Witness organization responded to real-life allegations of child sexual abuse against its members, and how its policies tend to protect the abuser. For instance, even if they fully believe the allegations made against a member, the congregation's judicial and spiritual leaders, known as elders, won't take any action unless there are at least 2 witnesses to the abuse, which is unlikely in view of the private nature of sexual abuse, or the abuser confesses voluntarily, which is again unlikely. Even when these exacting demands are met, justice is far from guaranteed. While the organization possesses the judicial apparatus to eject molesters from congregations, it repeatedly fails to use it. In a form of excommunication known as disfellowshipping, individuals judged to be unrepentant sinners are completely shunned by all members, including family. But individuals found guilty of molestation can avoid this fate just by apologizing. If they express repentance to their congregation's elders, they can simply be reproved. All this entails is an announcement being made to their congregation that they've been reprimanded for an unspecified transgression. And that's it. They'll be left in the congregation, risking further molestation and the constant re-traumatization of the individuals they've abused, who often feel forced out of their own congregation. These kinds of misguided policies serve to protect abusers and punish the abused. Through its in-depth investigation of individual cases, the Australian Royal Commission would expose a daunting maze of unthinkable additional hurdles faced by sexually abused children raised in the Jehovah's Witness organisation. The Commission focused on the experiences of 2 individuals abused by members of the organisation. For anonymity, the individuals were codenamed BCB and BCG. BCB was the first to take the witness stand. She testified to the following account. She was born in 1967. When she was 10, her mother became a Jehovah's Witness and started taking her and her brother to meetings. BCB drifted apart from her father, who didn't attend. At age 12, she met Bronwyn and Bill Neal and became friends with a daughter of theirs. She would attend meetings at their house and sleep over. Mr. Neal discouraged both girls from making non-witness friends at school, based on the idea that bad association spoils useful habits, a sentiment derived from the biblical passage 1 Corinthians 15, verse 33. The sexual jokes Mr. Neal started making in front of her would signal the onset of an escalating pattern of abuse. At age 14, when she stayed over with the Neal family, he started inserting his tongue in her mouth when he kissed her goodnight. She would endure these inappropriate kisses for the next 4 years. She felt ashamed and scared, and worried about upsetting Mrs. Neal. But Mr. Neal was an elder, and she submitted to his authority. When she was 17, he intruded on her while she was showering, somehow managing to unlock a locked door. He left when she screamed, "Get out!" but later gave her a vicious belting for making too much noise in her bedroom. At age 18, she was subjected to more overtly sexual behaviour. He called her a nymphomaniac and a prostitute. One time, Mrs. Neal caught him tongue-kissing BCB and stopped him, but nothing further was said or done, and his forcefulness escalated, culminating in an incident in which he trapped BCB in the bathroom and violated her, manually and orally. The next day, he entered her room and suggested she'd enjoy full intercourse. She asked him to leave, then packed and returned to her parents' farm. The next year, when he heard through his daughter that BCB had been seeing a couple of boys, Neal invoked his role as an elder to summon her to talk about boys. She felt she had no choice. He took the opportunity to inspect her physically and abuse her verbally. 2 years later, in 1989, having married, she confided in her husband and also in a friend about Neal's abuse. The friend then disclosed this information to someone else. A week or so later, a young elder called Max Hawley approached her to arrange a visit. During the visit, he revealed he'd come to talk about Neil. BCB gave some details, but was too ashamed to recount the bathroom incident. Hawley invited Neil to BCB's house to speak with her and her husband. Despite her discomfort at opening up her own home to her abuser, she did as she was told, on the assumption that Hawley knew the correct procedure. She didn't recall having the purpose of the meeting explained to her, and she felt too inhibited to recount the full details in front of Neil, or challenge him when he suggested his behaviour was meant as a joke. Afterwards, BCB approached Hawley and gave him more details. This led to a second meeting, with the additional attendance of one Doug Jackson, a circuit overseer, someone who supervises multiple congregations. His presence and the purpose of the meeting weren't explained. It was just presented as a committee meeting. Neil attempted to blame BCB for wearing revealing clothes, but Jackson said the church didn't accept that excuse. Again, Neil's presence inhibited her, as did being in a room full of men. She said if a female she trusted from the congregation had been there too, it might have been easier. At the end of the meeting, Neil was told to apologize, which he did. BCB was given no explanation of the meeting's outcome or of what would happen. Jackson gave her an article about child sexual abuse, published in one of the organization's magazines called The Watchtower. Not long after this, Mrs. Neil phoned BCB and told her Bill didn't abuse you. BCB reported this to Hawley, who said he'd sort it out. Later that day, he phoned and said, "The Neils have asked that you not tell any more people about Bill, out of respect for the family." Scared, disorientated, and unsupported, she did as she was told. It was only years later that she saw the perversity of being asked to respect the man who abused her, when nobody had offered her the respect or support she deserved. Weeks later, it was announced that Bill had stepped down as an elder, with no reason given. Nobody talked to BCB about her abuse, and she was still expecting this, heart palpitations, and difficulty breathing. She reported that her abuse destroyed her confidence and self-esteem, and instilled in her a sense of victimhood and a constant paranoia that people were judging her. She went on to experience suicidal thoughts and a nervous breakdown. She said Neil's position as an elder gave him power over her, and suggested that if she'd been allowed to speak to other children outside the congregation, they might have reported her abuse to the appropriate authorities. She suggested a number of changes in the way the organization dealt with child sexual abuse. She said it should take allegations more seriously and report them to the police, give proper support and protection for children, and not require female targets of male abuse to speak in front of a room full of men, including their alleged abuser. She also noted that no compensation was offered. The Commission sought to address all of these issues. Max Hawley was the next to testify, and sworn in on a biblical oath. Not long into Hawley's testimony, Assisting Counsel Stewart noted that he seemed hesitant in his recollections and asked if this was because of the passage of time, which Hawley affirmed. Judge McClellan asked Hawley if he'd taken notes. He said he might have at the time, but they would have been destroyed. When asked why, he said the elders didn't want their wives knowing what sort of things they were dealing with, and that it was also to protect the person involved and the rest of the congregation, so they didn't have to know about these things. It was not only a deeply patronizing rationale, but a dangerous one, leaving congregations unsuspecting about the molesters in their midst, which is exactly what molesters want. Hawley confirmed that destroying notes remained the current practice. When asked if he was aware of his obligations to tell authorities about serious allegations of sexual assault, Hawley showed no awareness and said he would contact his branch for advice on how to proceed.
Now I thought I'd come back on here and just talk about this a bit. Now you notice that he was talking about how they were told to destroy their notes. We did a video just recently on YouTube. I won't go to it right now, but it was a Kingdom Hall in York, the county of York in Pennsylvania, the state of Pennsylvania, And there was a news article, and the elder came out and said, yeah, the head office told us to buy shredders and shred all the records. I did not know this was happening for years, that they were destroying records. And some of the comments that we had said that letters came from the society, from the organization, telling elders to shred records all the way up to 2016. Something like that. So anyways, that was just a side point. I'll get out of here.
Unthinking deference to the branch would become a familiar stock response from the elders called to testify to the commission. Hawley expressed confusion about what constituted criminal assault and later admitted giving no consideration to reporting it to the police. This was an individual invested with the safety and protection of an unquestioningly trusting congregation, a shepherd charged with guarding the flock. But in the shepherd metaphor, Hawley was more like a sheepdog, cluelessly obeying the whistles of an unseen shepherd, who could just as easily direct him to harm the sheep as to protect them. The biblical passage Matthew 18, verse 15, has been cited by the organization as a basis for requiring abused individuals to confront their abusers with their allegations. McClellan asked Hawley if he realized how inappropriate this process of confrontation was. Hawley said he could understand it now, but hadn't reflected on it at the time, because he was just following procedure. He agreed it could be very difficult for people who'd suffered abuse to share everything done to them in front of their abuser. He said the organization wanted to keep Neil's abuse as quiet as possible, not to try to cover it up, just to stop the conversation. But almost immediately, he contradicted himself, saying they would have tried to keep the matter under wraps. In other words, cover it up. Stewart made the case to Hawley that by directing BCB not to speak to anyone in the congregation, he left her with no one to talk to. Hawley suggested that because BCB was still working in the community, she could have spoken to people outside the organization. But Stewart pointed out that members are advised not to have close friendships or associations with non-members. Hawley affirmed that was true, but said that whether members took that advice or not was entirely up to them. Many of us who've experienced abusive environments will be familiar with this responsibility-dodging maneuver, in which individuals are given clear instructions on what to do or what not to do. Then, when they suffer as a direct consequence of following those instructions, they're told they didn't have to follow them after all, and they're blamed for their own suffering. The fact is, Jehovah's Witnesses are warned in the strongest terms against what are called bad associations with non-members, which they're told will result in disaster. For Hawley to suggest that BCB was somehow supposed to view this merely as a piece of advice she was free to take or leave was disingenuous in the extreme. Stewart put it to Hawley that he was saying two different things. On one hand, saying BCB couldn't speak to people, then on the other, that she could. Hawley claimed he didn't mean to cut BCB off from any support, but admitted he couldn't recall arranging anyone to assist her through the period. Stewart produced a letter from Hawley and the circuit overseer Doug Jackson to their branch office. The letter said, "It appears that a number of brothers know about the matter, and unfortunately there may be worldly people who also know." Worldly is the derogatory term Jehovah's Witnesses use for non-members. Stewart asked why it mattered if worldly people knew. Hawley said the organization didn't want anything to detract from their clean reputation. In fact, the organization is heavily invested in its reputation among outsiders. It seems perverse that it should be so concerned about what worldly people think, considering it despises us as debauched and degenerate, characterizes us as the instigators of broken homes, illegitimate births, and sexually transmitted diseases, and countless other emotional and physical woes, and compares us to what it calls death-dealing polluted air. But, of course, projecting a clean image is what the organization relies on to attract new members, and it has no moral qualms whatsoever about using deception to try and maintain that patently false image. It even has a formal policy called theocratic warfare that gives members explicit permission to deceive worldly people on the grounds they're not entitled to the truth. I explored the perversity of this policy in my Concealing Abuse video. What that video doesn't mention is a particular exception to the policy, one of special relevance to the Royal Commission. Witnesses are told that when they take an oath to tell the truth, or are placed on a witness stand, they're obligated to speak the truth, if they speak at all. In these circumstances, the only option they have, other than to speak the truth, is to remain silent. It'll become clear that even this rule was flouted by Jehovah's Witnesses during the Commission hearing. It'll also become increasingly clear.
I thought this was crazy when I watched this part of it. I did not know that that theocratic warfare was about deception. That you could use theocratic warfare to deceive or not tell the truth. So I'd be interesting to see whose comments are out there. But this, to me, this goes to show what goes on in elders' rooms, in the elders' books, between circuit overseers, between district overseers, and of course, this all comes from the governing body. They're the ones that are culpable. But not only them, now we're being brought out that there's 40 members. There's a whole big board of directors. And I haven't looked into that too hard. But that's something a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses don't know about, is that they have a lot of members on the board of directors. And it could be the board of directors that is pushing, let's say, push Tony Moritz out. Who knows? But there's a lot going behind the scenes. This commission here has helped the whole world. So I'm going to get off here and let's keep watching it.
Just how far down in their list of priorities came the welfare of the children they were supposed to protect? Hawley and Jackson's letter about Bill Neal to the branch office stated, "We recommended to him that he step down as an elder, and that he agreed to this." Stewart put it to Hawley that it seemed that they'd offered Neal a chance to step down voluntarily, rather than be forcibly removed. Hawley denied this, claiming it was just an unfortunate choice of words. But those unfortunate words were consistent with BCB's previous testimony that Neal had merely stepped down. In the same letter, Hawley and Jackson added that they felt no further action or restrictions need apply. This meant Neal was free to participate in all the same church and Bible study meetings as before, including meetings at his home, which BCB was expected to attend. The letter went on to make the bizarrely premature recommendation that once the matter had died down, Neal should be recommended as an elder again, so he could help the congregation as he'd done in the past. Stewart asked Hawley if, by the phrase dying down, he meant once the controversy had abated. Hawley claimed that the term dying down was another case of unfortunate wording. When Stewart then suggested that Hawley's prime concern was about Neal's reputation, he initially rejected the idea, but Stewart continued along this line, suggesting that Hawley's concern was about the functioning of his organisation and not about the protection of children in his congregation. Hawley agreed. When Stewart put it to him, his concern wasn't about the support he could offer BCB. Hawley admitted that while that had some bearing for him, it was more about Neal's qualifications to teach. It was a stunning confession. Towards the end of his period in the witness stand, Hawley was given a detailed account of BCB's abuse. He hadn't known about any of it, and said it came as a shock to him. He was asked if he thought the fact that it was only coming to light now had something to do with the process he engaged in when BCB made the initial complaint, a process in which she had to make her allegations to her abuser and an elder who she knew was friends with her abuser. He said he could see the point being made. When it was suggested BCB needed a more nurturing, supportive environment to make a full disclosure, he agreed. But when asked if he had any thoughts on what the organisation should do about it, he reverted to compliant form, saying he had no comments. He just followed the procedures. What came across from many elders called to testify at the commission was that they were so immersed in procedure, they failed to consider the accuser's experience. Doug Jackson's responses clearly illustrated this lack of empathy. When it was put to Jackson that BCB was unaware of the purpose of the meeting she was attending, initially he flat out rejected the idea. But Stewart took some time to remind him that as an elder, he had knowledge not given to the congregation, knowledge of judicial procedures, standards of evidence, punitive measures. Stewart then asked Jackson if he'd accept BCB wouldn't know about these things. Jackson changed his no to a maybe. Stewart asked if Jackson could see how this lack of transparency would have left BCB in a position of vulnerability and confusion. Jackson said he did now. Stewart repeated to Jackson the portion of BCB's statement in which she was asked in one of the judicial meetings whether she had anything more to tell, and she falsely responded no, because of various inhibiting factors. These included talking in front of a room full of men, talking in front of her abuser, and being afraid of the consequences of telling the truth. Jackson
Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about that. If you've ever been in a judicial meeting, you're in there all alone. So I have had ones in my family, children, that have had to go to judicial meetings. And of course, if a child is underage, the parent gets to go. So I would go with the child. And here you would have the three elders asking all these pointed questions and to the child. And in this case, I said, enough of this, brothers. There's no more of this. But you see, if a lot of times the child just goes in, or the young person just goes in, and there's no parent. So the parent, the guardian, is always allowed to go, but a lot of times the guardian doesn't go in, because they just want, they trust these elders. These three elders, they appear, they're huge to the child. And it's overbearing, and the child's not going to talk. Even with the parent there, a lot of times the parent, the elders say, well, maybe the parent should leave. So they send the parent out to the coat room so they can talk one-on-one with the child. There's a lot of this nonsense going on, and I'm so happy that this is all being exposed. We are living in the time that this is all coming out. I had no clue the 30 years I spent in this organization that this is what the upper management, the elders who are in Jesus' right hands, this is how they run the show. And it's all coming out. This is why we know that this organization is worse than the Catholic organization. It's worse than the ones that they have condemned. And it's important that we get this information out onto the mainstream. If you guys are watching this program, you can share it, like it, and all those things. It really helps the cause. And I'm not going to say our channel, it helps the cause, because there's a lot of people now coming out of the organization, and there's a lot of this we're going to hear. There's just a little bit more in the program. Let's keep listening to this, and then we'll get on the live and chat.
Accepted that talking about her abuse in front of a room full of men would have been very hard for BCB, as would talking in front of her abuser. But when it was put to him that BCB didn't feel it was a safe environment, he said he didn't know why she would have felt that, because they tried to comfort her. He seemed unable to comprehend that his supposed efforts to comfort BCB weren't enough to magically overcome all the intimidating factors she identified. Instead of admitting that he had failed to comfort her, his instinct was instead to insinuate that the failure was hers. She had failed to receive the comfort he offered. This kind of mindset is common in high-control groups that deny individuality. Members are slotted into fixed procedures and expected to give fixed reactions. When they don't, the fault is with them, not the procedure. McClellan put it to Jackson that the organization's investigative process inflicted further trauma on BCB. Jackson said he understood that now, but hadn't appreciated it at the time. It's instructive to reflect on the reflex dismissiveness of the elders who testified at the commission whenever it was suggested that the abused individuals in their care felt unsafe or unsupported. Judge McClellan and Assisting Counsel Stewart were two highly skilled communicators. They also wielded the power of the legal system, but even they had to repeatedly spend exhausting swathes of time walking the elders through their own procedures, trying to get them to empathize with the experiences of those abused individuals. If, with their considerable skill and power, they had to work this hard to break through the elders' dismissiveness, What chance did an unskilled, powerless member of a Jehovah's Witness congregation have of making themselves heard? Another elder concerned with reputation was Joe Bello, one of the elders BCB wrote to years after the abuse, in an effort to protect other children from Bill Neal. Asked about whether he would ever report a matter to the police, Bello fell back on the mantra-like evasion given by the other elders. He'd contact the branch. Bello confirmed BCB's account that when her husband had mentioned they were thinking of talking to the Royal Commission, Bello had asked what that would accomplish, other than dragging Jehovah's name through the mud. It was put to him that this would be understood as a discouragement against going to the Commission. He said that wasn't how it was meant. He was just thinking aloud. Although Bello initially seemed to regret his words and reflected that he shouldn't have said them, he then revealed that he stood by the underlying sentiment. Stewart asked him if, within his faith, Jehovah was considered a loving God. When Bello confirmed this, Stewart asked if Jehovah would not also then be more concerned about the victim than his own name. Defiantly, Bello replied, Jehovah would be concerned about the victim, but Jehovah is concerned about his own name too. Judge McClellan asked Bello if he'd been following the work of the Royal Commission. Bello hadn't, despite knowing a couple of months previously that he would have to give evidence. He said he might have scanned the headlines of the Saturday paper, but he didn't watch the news or listen to the radio. His complete lack of interest in the Commission's work was abundantly clear, and consistent with the apathy exhibited by most of the witnesses testifying for the organization.
Isn't that true when we think of what happens within the organization? This elder, he had no regard for the victim, the one that was abused, and they had to go to all that work. The commission and the police and all the elders that they talked to, they had to go to a lot of work to get the elders to be concerned even a little bit about the victim. And the other thing that bothers me is how they go on, well, it's all about Jehovah's name, Jehovah's name, Jehovah's name. Well, if Jehovah's a loving God, wouldn't Jehovah be concerned about the weak, the orphans, the widows? Isn't that what the Bible book of James 1:27 says? Yes. So this is nonsense when we look at this. And the other thing, how can man here on earth speak for Jehovah? How do Jehovah's Witnesses run around and they do all this talking for Jehovah? Jehovah this, Jehovah this, Jehovah this. We do it for Jehovah's name, Jehovah this. You see, Jehovah doesn't need them or man to talk for him. The Almighty God does not need a man for any of that. If Jehovah wants to do something about his name, well, he's going to expose Jehovah's Witnesses. He's going to expose the ones that are bringing reproach upon his name. And that's what's happening today, folks. It's ironic of what they're saying in court here. I'm going to get off and just finish this here.
Dr. Monica Applewhite was paid by the organization to be an expert witness in its defense. Applewhite presented herself as an independent consultant in child sexual abuse, visiting institutes to make risk assessments and develop educational programs and policies. This included assessing how they prevented abuse, how they responded to warning signs, how they responded to disclosures of abuse, and how they remedied the situation. Applewhite was an unexpected choice of champion for the Jehovah's Witnesses because she was an active member of the Catholic Church, which the organization has repeatedly dismissed as a false religion, characterized as an enemy of true worship, criticized for its political meddling, and slated for its handling of child sexual abuse. Leaving aside the strangeness of this alliance, Applewhite's testimony was a mess. Stewart and McClellan noted that many opinions offered in her report had no source references. Applewhite said she was already fully scheduled when she started working on the report, so she hadn't been conscientious about her citations. In fact, what emerged from Applewhite's report and testimony was that her so-called expert evidence consisted of browsing online material from the organization's own website and speaking to staff from its legal branch. She said she hadn't reviewed any specific cases and couldn't offer any opinion on whether the implementation of the organization's policies had resulted in law-abiding responses, good practice of child protection, or compassionate care. As Stewart noted, all she'd basically done was a documentary review. Applewhite showed a distinct lack of awareness of the power relationship between elders and congregation members, erroneously stating that elders were merely viewed as fellow workers by the congregation. As Stewart pointed out, elders were very clearly characterized by the organization as shepherds over the flock. Their privilege and authority was reinforced by the belief that elders were directly appointed by the Holy Spirit, another fact of which she was unaware. Applewhite stated there was no requirement for elders or ministerial servants to be alone with children, but Stewart produced a branch document directed to all elders, stating that elders and ministerial servants are put in a position of trust that explicitly included being more liberal about leaving children in their care. Applewhite was also unaware of the fact that abused children were cautioned not to reveal facts about the congregation in group therapy. The only stipulation she had heard in regards to therapy was that the organization recommended choosing someone who respected their religious beliefs. As the facts about the actual experience of abused individuals emerged, Applewhite began to withdraw some of her poorly considered support for the organization. She announced that if it turned out that people had to confront their abusers and had to sit in a room with no support, that would not meet the standards of care. She conceded she hadn't understood that that was the process. Applewhite stated that when somebody abuses, and their internal mechanisms of control had allowed them to cross that line once, she didn't have confidence in those internal mechanisms of control for the future. As such, she suggested that the risk of reoffence was great, and agreed that positive steps needed to be taken to ensure that such a person didn't have access or the opportunity to abuse again. She said there should be strong and cooperative relationships with child protection authorities, but had no awareness of the difficult relationship the Jehovah's Witness organization had with secular authorities. The Commission didn't consider that Applewhite's report had assisted their inquiry, and rejected her opinions on numerous grounds, including lack of evidence or citations, but most damningly, because she had failed to investigate the experiences of a single survivor of child sexual abuse whose complaint was dealt with by the Jehovah's Witness organization. By the end of this first case, the Royal Commission had already gathered confirmation of unthinkable negligence, deeply inappropriate and traumatizing procedures, and a cover-up mentality that elevated reputation far above the protection of children and led to the use of shaming tactics on abused individuals to try and silence them. From this atrocious start, things would only get worse. As I'll be showing in Part 2, shocking new levels of deception and corruption within the organization would be laid bare, including evidence that some elders had stooped to breaking their own rules in order to avoid exposing abuse.
Well, that's part one. I'm just going to move over here to the live chat, see how we're doing. Well, we still have quite a few online. I have time. If everyone wants to stay online, we can run part 2 on this commission. And this gives us a little insight. I know for myself, I didn't have a lot of insight as to what was going on with the Royal Commission and how this all got exposed. But this really set the stage for the world. And the world is now looking at this. This video has come from a therapy group from the UK that provides therapy. We're going to look at some more other stuff in other programs coming up. But I think we have a lot of people online. I think I'm going to keep running this, and we're going to take a look at the next video, part 2 on this program. So we're going to go down and open it up here. Part 2.
Be reproved. The congregation is informed.
And turn it on here.
This is the second part of a series exploring the findings of the Australian Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. In part 1, I looked at the first of 2 cases of abuse investigated within the Jehovah's Witness organisation, the case of a woman codenamed BCB, who was abused by an elder, a spiritual leader in her congregation. Chairing the commission was Justice Peter McClellan. Assisting counsel for the commission was Angus Stewart, QC. As that case showed, various policies of the Jehovah's Witnesses combine very effectively to protect child molesters and silence their targets. The organisation demands that there are 2 or more witnesses to the molestation, or that the molester confesses, both of which are highly unlikely. Those who are found guilty can be disfellowshipped, a form of excommunication in which individuals are shunned by the entire organisation. But this is also highly unlikely, because molesters are told if they express repentance, they'll simply be reproved. Their congregation is informed that they've been reprimanded for an unspecified transgression. What is highly likely is that abused children, receiving no justice and faced with continued exposure to their molester, will feel driven to leave the organisation. Unfortunately, this can result in them being shunned. No provision is made for individuals who simply want to stop being a Jehovah's Witness, but maintain personal relationships with other members. They're not given that choice. They must remain under the organisation's authority, or dissociate themselves and be completely shunned. Even if they decide to stay, abused individuals who develop alcohol, drug or other related problems can find themselves disfellowshipped for that. The cards are stacked overwhelmingly against abused children. But the Commission's second investigation into the organisation, the case of BCG, would uncover evidence of unsuspected new depths of corruption. Taking the witness stand, BCG testified to the following account. She was born in Brisbane in 1971, the second oldest of 7 children, with an older sister and 2 younger sisters. Her father joined the organisation when she was very young, followed by her mother, and became a ministerial servant, assisting the elders of the congregation. He exercised dictatorial control, forbidding his family from reading non-Jehovah's Witness literature or associating with non-members. BCG was baptised at 16. She was sure the congregation knew about her father's violent nature. He frequently beat her with a leather strap, and she'd sometimes attend meetings still bleeding. She had blurry feelings that he'd abused her sexually around age 5, and a clear recollection of inappropriate kissing and sexual compliments from him in her early teens. At 17, the abuse escalated when her mother and siblings were away for a fortnight in Brisbane. Left alone, she was repeatedly assaulted by her father, despite her father threatening to beat her and kick her out if she spoke to anyone without him being present. BCG eventually approached the wife of an elder called Kevin Bowditch, but was told he couldn't talk to her without her father present. Twice, she approached another elder, Dino Ally, a good friend of her father's. Despite her obvious distress, again, she was told her father had to be present. Eventually, BCG told the person who would become her future husband. He persuaded Ally to meet him and BCG. She said Ally seemed incensed at her and warned her she was making a very serious allegation. She said she knew that. A number of meetings were arranged between BCG, Ally, Bowditch, and another elder, Rhonda Roy. She wasn't told about their purpose. Again, she was met with anger and asked highly inappropriate questions, like, "Did you enjoy it?" Because the elders were all male, and also her father's friends, she was reluctant to give them details, and only answered direct questions. They instructed her to tell her mother about the abuse. When she did, reveal that her father had abused her older sister. BCG asked how she could have left her alone with him. Her mother said she didn't think he'd do it again, because he was a Jehovah's Witness. BCG and her mother then spoke to the 2 youngest daughters, around ages 5 and 7. They both reported sexual assaults by their father. BCG and her mother told the elders, but Rhonda Roy told them "We don't want to talk to your sisters because they're too young to know what they're talking about." The elders said BCG had to put her allegations to her father. Terrified, she went ahead for the sake of her younger sisters. In the meeting, her father threatened to flog her, hit her, and kill her. The elders only intervened when he got up and moved towards her. Eventually, he was disfellowshipped, but DeRoy told her it wasn't for abusing her, but for some other misconduct. When she asked why, he said they needed 2 or more witnesses. When she mentioned her sisters, he said it had to be the same event. Her father appealed his disfellowshipping, and BCG was called to appear before a judicial panel of 3 elders from other congregations. She had to recount her experiences all over again, but eventually her father confessed to stepping out of line. His appeal was rejected. Eventually, he moved away from the area. BCG said many congregation members accused her of lying. Although she was married later that year, she felt worthless and alone, and attempted suicide by overdose, an act for which she was later chastised by DeRoy because it was considered a serious transgression against Jehovah. A few years later, DeRoy informed her that her father was being reinstated because he was doing all the right things. When asked what these right things were, he said her father was attending meetings. She reminded him her father was attending meetings when he was abusing her and her sisters. BCG told DeRoy the congregation wasn't safe and she was going to take it to the police. In response, she said he quoted a Bible passage that forbids taking brothers to court, and he warned that she could be disfellowshipped for bringing reproach on Jehovah. She wrote to senior officials in the organization, but no action was taken. Instead, they sent a letter counseling her to preserve her tears in a skin bottle. This was a reference to Psalms 56 verse 8, which depicted the biblical God collecting tears in his skin bottle and recording them in a book. After her 3rd son was born, she separated from her husband and left the organization, disillusioned by its hypocrisy and doubting the claim that its senior members were divinely appointed. On leaving, she reported her abuse to the police. Unlike the Jehovah's Witness organization, the secular courts had rules protecting her from inappropriate questioning. Her father was convicted and given a 3-year sentence. Speaking about the police and the Royal Commission staff, she said she'd had more support, acknowledgement and acceptance from complete strangers than she'd ever had from her congregation, and she hoped that the Jehovah's Witness organization would be made criminally and financially accountable for its failure to protect children. Dino Ally, an elder for 20 years, was the first to be questioned about the BCG case. He was asked about why he'd initially dismissed her request to talk to him. Ally embarked on a lengthy defense that was conflicted to the point of incoherence. He claimed absolutely no recollection of the conversation, then declared he would never have told her to talk to her father first, then said there wasn't enough information to comment on whether he would say that. Then he said he wasn't denying what she'd said. Finally, in the most strangulated evasion, he said, "I'm not saying that I'm denying that that's something that she may have assumed that I said or that she said." Instead of giving up in the face of this protracted tap dance, Judge McClellan continued to pursue a straight answer. He established that the organization requires members to first approach those they have a disagreement with. He then suggested that BCG's testimony that Ally told her to talk to her father first was consistent with this teaching. Finally, after more tap dancing, Ally admitted the consistency. It took a staggering 11.5 minutes to push through Ally's deflections and evasions to get that simple acknowledgement, and that was on an incident he didn't even recall. Ally claimed he and the other elders all believed BCG's allegations, but said they couldn't act on that belief without corroboration from another person. In line with the organization's policies, he said they needed either 2 witnesses to the abuse or a confession from the perpetrator. But as the commission went on to show, both these requirements were fulfilled. Ally initially claimed not to recollect the allegations made by BCG's younger sisters, but a document called Notes of Investigating Committee was later produced by Stewart. It had been obtained from the police, who'd used it in their prosecution of BCG's father. It was handwritten by Ally and dated at the time of the original meetings with BCG. In it, Ally noted that BCG's father had possibly abused the two younger daughters, as well as the older daughter, at age 2. Ally further noted that BCG's father had admitted that all the allegations of molestation were true. So, the elders had multiple witnesses and a confession, and yet they did nothing. Judge McClellan pointed out that Ally had previously told him he hadn't got a confession. After some flustering, Ally claimed they needed to make sure the confession was true. It was incoherent nonsense. Ally had previously stated that all the elders believed BCG's account, but on receiving a confession that confirmed the account they already believed, they were suddenly unwilling to accept the confession was true. Ally's suggestion that confessions needed to be substantiated was shown to be false. When BCG's father confessed at his appeal hearing, in front of 3 elders from other congregations, it was accepted. Ally's requirement of further substantiation was an unnecessary, cruel, and callous imposition on an abused individual who had jumped through hoop after humiliating hoop to meet all the organization's judicial requirements. Like many elders summoned to speak to the commission, Kevin Bowditch showed no great concern for the consequences of failing to deal with molesters. When questioned about the potential danger from a known child molester to the wider community, including children outside the organization, he glibly responded, "What ability have we got to protect every child in Australia?" When Stewart gave the obvious answer that they could report to the Child Protection Authorities, Bowditch said that was done in some cases. But Stewart put it to him that this wasn't a voluntary practice. It wasn't done unless there was a legal requirement to do so. Bowditch confirmed that was true. As with virtually all the elders summoned to testify, including Ally, Bowditch had declined to watch BCG's testimony or read her statement. Stewart asked why this was. Bowditch claimed it was because he preferred to be truthful and speak from his own point of view. When Stewart asked Bowditch why abused individuals were required to face their abusers, he suggested it could start the healing process. He said it was so people like BCG could get it out and tell the person who'd carried out this vile act. But in Bowditch's own statement, he recalled BCG's father being verbally aggressive and physically threatening towards his daughter, who appeared frightened. There was nothing healing about this atmosphere of intimidation, and Bowditch conceded Stewart's point that it hadn't been conducive to arriving at the truth. Even within Jehovah's Witness literature, there's an acknowledgement that far from healing, confrontations can cause more damage and trauma, sparking denial and more abuse. The organization's literature even acknowledges that forgiveness isn't necessarily appropriate. The point has to be made that an all-knowing God would know how damaging these confrontations could be for abused individuals. So, who determined that these confrontations should be judicial procedure? Was it a callous, incompetent God? Or callous, incompetent humans falsely claiming to speak for a God? Like all his colleagues, Ron DeRoy, an elder for 29 years, declined to view BCG's testimony. When asked why, he said he didn't want to listen to it so he could be objective. He said he wanted to be honest in any questions that he was asked. But it later emerged that he had watched Dino Ally's testimony. Stewart asked if he wasn't concerned that this would jeopardize his objectivity. DeRoy replied he wanted to be honest. So, he avoided BCG's testimony because he wanted to be honest, but watched Ally's testimony because he wanted to be honest. It didn't hang together. It didn't go unnoticed that all the elders had avoided BCG's testimony, echoing the real-life shunning of ex-members practiced by the organization. One individual who didn't follow this pattern was an ex-Jehovah's Witness called Monty Baker. Formerly an elder of the congregation to which BCG's father eventually moved, unlike DeRoy and the other elders, Baker had followed the proceedings closely, including BCG's testimony. As a result, many old memories came back to him, prompting him to make several amendments to his initial statement. He said he was sure the significance of the occasion would motivate everyone giving evidence to be fully clear on every aspect. DeRoy appeared to have virtually no recollection of his part in the elders' investigation into BCG's allegations. He claimed he couldn't recall a single detail of the acts of molestation BCG reported to him and the other elders, which led to a confusing moment when, some way into his testimony, he seemed keen to impress upon the commission that he was sickened by what BCG's father did to her. Stewart asked what sickened him. After some prevarication, he grinned and claimed he couldn't remember. DeRoy's testimony followed a distinct pattern. When asked about his involvement in the BCG investigation, he claimed no memory. When confronted with an alleged event that put him in an especially bad light, on top of claiming no memory, he also tried to argue that it couldn't have happened. An example of this was when Stewart read from BCG's statement that DeRoy had said he didn't want to talk to her sisters because they were too young to know what they were talking about. DeRoy claimed not to recall this. Stewart asked if he was saying it didn't happen. DeRoy evaded the question and instead commented that if the elders had known her sisters were abused too, that would have given them more witnesses to follow through on. Stewart then presented Dino Alli's own handwritten notes confirming that the elders did know about BCG's sisters, and that her father had confessed. DeRoy then claimed to remember very precisely that at the first judicial meeting, the elders only had BCG's word against her father. But this supposed precise memory did nothing to erase the hard evidence of Alli's notes, which supported BCG's testimony that her sister's abuse was reported, but ignored. Throughout DeRoy's testimony, he repeatedly delivered flippant responses with the same bizarre grin. When Judge McClellan asked him if he thought it was right that after her father was disfellowshipped, it was BCG who was removed from the family home, while her abuser remained there, DeRoy grinned and said if he'd cared about his daughter, he would have made it a lot easier for her. To expect care from a father who'd beaten and threatened BCG and molested all of his daughters was maybe the clearest mark of DeRoy's total rejection of personal responsibility. DeRoy's responses ranged from vague to garbled to obtuse. At one point, Stewart put it to him that he was speaking in riddles. Reflecting on his conduct at the commission, it was sobering to think this individual was responsible for the care of abused children. Further damning facts about the organization emerged when some Jehovah's Witness officials were brought in to explain the organization's policies and procedures. Rodney Spinks, a Jehovah's Witness for over 40 years, was a senior member of the service department in the organization's branch office and assisted elders in implementing guidelines for handling child abuse allegations. Vincent Toole, baptized in 1972, had overseen operations in the legal department of the branch office since 2010. Terence O'Brien, baptized in 1976, was the current coordinator of the Jehovah's Witness Australia Branch Committee. Spinks was first to give evidence, and it soon became clear that the organization's documentation for handling child abuse allegations was hopelessly fragmented. There was no clear, centralized set of guidelines that was accessible to all congregants. Spinks said the guidelines were outlined in various sources, including the organization's translation of the Bible, a confidential elders' handbook called Shepherd the Flock of God, confidential letters sent to the body of elders, and articles in the organization's magazines, like The Watchtower. In one farcical moment, Spinks said he'd found a document showing abused individuals didn't have to confront their abusers, but admitted no one had a copy of the document until they found an older member of the department who'd photocopied it, reduced it, and stuck it in his book. Stewart commented that it was like trying to put your finger on a ball of mercury. Just when you think you have it, it pops up somewhere else. If senior advisors couldn't navigate their own guidelines, what hope did an abused child have? The passive language of the guidelines also became apparent. Stewart noted that there was no instruction in the confidential Elders Handbook to actively inform congregants of their right to contact authorities. Only if the elders were asked were they to tell congregants it was their personal decision. This is not the advice of a supportive organisation, but of one that wants no involvement. Any abused individual who fails to raise the subject themselves will never get the reassurance that it's their right to go to the police. The end result is that abusers are shielded from the police. Stewart highlighted the hypocrisy of this passive position, putting it to Spinks that if he saw someone breaking into a neighbour's house, or received reliable information of a murder, he'd immediately report it to the police. Spinks confirmed he would. Beyond hypocrisy, Judge McClellan explained to Spinks the potential criminality of not reporting. If elders determine that an allegation is true, it ceases to be knowledge of an allegation and becomes knowledge or belief of a criminal offence. In New South Wales, where Spinks was based, criminal sanctions could be imposed on people who knew or believed a criminal offence had been committed and didn't report. Stewart further noted that if contacting child protection authorities was an automatic first step, there'd be no need for elders to interview the child. Elders who, Stewart noted, had no training in interviewing traumatized children. Spinks agreed. McClellan also noted that civil authorities had the benefit of decades of scientific research in the assessment and treatment of abusers, none of which was available to the Jehovah's Witnesses. Research that underscored the high risk of reoffending. But, in a jarring moment of defiance, Spinks had already said the Bible would prevail over science, and had proudly cited Jehovah's Witnesses in South Korea, Russia, Azerbaijan, and Eritrea who'd gone to prison for their beliefs. He said the organisation would continue to reprove and reinstate individuals who showed themselves sufficiently repentant. When it was put to him that there was a clear inducement for people to pretend to be repentant, if it meant they avoided punishment, Spinks conceded that was possible. Vincent Toole admitted to receiving 3 or 4 allegations of child sexual abuse every month. A trained solicitor himself, Toole conceded no formal training was required to be an elder, even though the position entailed far-reaching responsibility for the welfare of many people. Toole claimed that before someone was nominated as an elder, the organisation would use a formal working with children clearance check to establish a clean record. But Stewart noted that such checking systems depend on accurate databases of sexual offences. If the authorities aren't informed of offences, then the efficacy of the checking is compromised. With the Jehovah's Witnesses' record of not reporting offences, it seemed the organisation wanted to benefit from this external database, but not contribute to it. Toole repeatedly claimed he'd have no hesitation reporting abuse to the police, but only if there was no other way to protect the child. In practice, this situation is highly unlikely because the organisation believes it provides effective protection by moving children out of their homes, like they did with BCG, in the process cutting her off from family life. And indeed, when Toole was asked directly whether he'd ever gone to the police, he admitted he hadn't. Toole initially claimed the legal department had been instructed to direct elders to clearly tell victims they have an absolute right to report their abuse to authorities. But when asked to cite these instructions, he couldn't. He scaled down to a lesser claim that it was in the spirit of the organisation's literature to report, and he admitted he'd received no formal instructions. Toole played the human rights champion, repeatedly claiming the organisation's reluctance to contact authorities was about protecting people's right to decide what was in their own best interests. But genuine human rights champions inform people of their rights, because without that awareness, people can't exercise their rights. In contrast, Jehovah's Witness children have been kept unaware of their rights. Toole protested that they didn't live in a cocoon, but they do. The Jehovah's Witness organization is a separatist group whose literature repeatedly warns against bad associations with non-members. Chapter 5 of the organization's book, Keep Yourself in God's Love, is explicitly titled How to Keep Separate from the World, and opens with John 15, verse 19. You are not part of this world. You don't have to be physically isolated to be effectively cocooned. You simply have to be kept in trusting ignorance, warned against associating with non-members, and threatened with punishment or even abandonment for disobedience. When asked what improvements the Jehovah's Witness organization could make in handling child sexual abuse, Terence O'Brien was quite forthcoming. He said clearer documentation was needed regarding policy. The right to report needed to be clearly explained, and procedures needed to be clearly explained to anyone alleging abuse. One thing O'Brien wasn't clear on was protecting the congregation. McClellan asked how the elders would safeguard the congregation if they fully believed the allegations of abuse against someone, but couldn't meet the organization's requirements for proof, like the two-witness rule. O'Brien said the elders would put restrictions on that person's association with children. When McClellan noted that this depended on elders observing the transgression, O'Brien added that congregants could report it to them, but McClellan pointed out that congregants wouldn't know to report it because they weren't told about the restrictions. O'Brien agreed. The lack of basic thought given to safeguarding procedures was staggering. O'Brien ruled out any change regarding the two-witness rule, or giving women a role in the investigative process. He confirmed the bizarre scriptural reasons for forbidding women to exercise authority over men, citing 1 Timothy chapter 2. Reason 1. Adam was formed before Eve. This is a straightforward non sequitur. The birth order of the Bible's first two humans has no logical connection to the respective attributes of modern men and women. Reason 2. Adam wasn't deceived, but Eve was. In fact, according to the Bible, Adam and Eve both succumbed to exactly the same inducement, being told they wouldn't die if they ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So, this second reason is a lie, one for which female Jehovah's Witnesses pay. On the subject of lies, it emerged that O'Brien had knowingly given the Commission false information about a potential witness. McClellan had previously inquired about the possibility of hearing from a member of the organization's governing body, one Jeffrey Jackson, who was currently in Australia. Under instruction from O'Brien, counsel for the Jehovah's Witness organization, Mr. Tockley, told the Commission that Jackson would probably not be any assistance because his role was confined to translating material. But, in fact, as a member of the governing body, Jackson was part of an elite ruling council of anointed servants, giving direction to the organization, approving publications, and shaping doctrine. And O'Brien knew it. McClellan took a dim view of this misrepresentation, and Jackson was summoned. The subterfuge that surrounded Jeffrey Jackson's appearance at the Commission would continue into his testimony, which was full of diversions, evasions, ambiguities, and falsehoods. He would repeatedly sidestep the point of a question, often reinventing the question. For example, when Judge McClellan asked him if there was any biblical impediment to a woman being appointed to investigate an allegation, Jackson replied that there was no impediment to a woman being involved with the investigation. He persisted with this particular evasion ad nauseum, and only gave a straight answer when eventually Stewart remarked that a person making tea during the investigation is involved. The question was about who makes the decision. Following O'Brien's lead, Jackson made several misrepresentations about his role in the organization. He presented an egalitarian fantasy in which governing body members viewed themselves merely as fellow workers with other Jehovah's Witnesses, and suggested that if the governing body gave some direction not in harmony with divine word, it would be picked up on by Jehovah's Witnesses worldwide. In reality, The governing body is an authority that determines all the organization's policies and procedures, and it expects obedience. Individuals can be disfellowshipped for disagreeing with them on the charge of causing divisions. For example, some Jehovah's Witnesses have called for the reform of the doctrine forbidding blood transfusions. As reformists have noted, the scripture presented in justification of this doctrine explicitly mentions eating blood. There is no biblical concept of transfusions, but for expressing this disagreement, reformists have been disfellowshipped. When Stewart asked him if they saw themselves as Jehovah's spokespeople on earth, Jackson said that would seem quite presumptuous. But in a 2001 article in the organization's
To me, this is the biggest point where Jackson really sunk himself, because they view themselves as God's representative. So, as we go through this whole thing, and I could have stopped many times over, but time is running out and we want to get through this. We're just about at the end, so hang in there. But this really shows us, as ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, what a lying organization of leaders we were under. Now, when on this channel, we're not condemning Jehovah's Witnesses as people, but when we look at the hierarchy of the organization, it's like gangrene, and it's getting exposed, and it's no wonder the God up there is exposing this stuff, and we're all a part of it right here. Right here, we are making history. And when these leaders lie
of the biblical God, Jackson also misrepresented the organization's stance on corporal punishment. McClellan asked straightforwardly if his church accepted the corporal punishment of children. Jackson evaded the question, saying his church expected that parents have the responsibility to discipline and raise their children. McClellan said that didn't answer his question, and repeated it. After more evasions, Jackson finally said the organization didn't accept or encourage it. But the Watchtower magazine explicitly promotes both verbal and physical punishment. An article called Disciplining Children for Life claims a spanking can be a lifesaver to a child, and says that beating children with a rod won't kill them. It suggests a rebuke can work for meeker children, whereas a whipping should discipline more stubborn children. A 2006 article called Reliable Advice for Raising Children also promotes a combination of the rod and reproof, charitably noting not all children need physical punishment. Returning to the issue of sexual abuse, McClellan asked about the possibility of giving women a decision-making role. After some evasion, Jackson confirmed the organization's doctrine that only men could be judges, and claimed this was based on scripture. But Jackson forgot the prophetess Deborah, whose story is told in chapter 4 of the Bible's Book of Judges. The book depicts 6 major and 6 minor judges. Deborah was a major judge who made legal decisions. It would seem there is biblical precedent for giving women decision-making roles. When Stewart put it to him that many females would feel more comfortable speaking to a woman about their abuse, Jackson rejected the idea. He said unlike what he called your churches, where people didn't talk to each other, Jehovah's Witness congregations became familiar and friendly. Leaving aside his ignorant comment on the social relationships of other churches, his argument appeared to be that any abused female members should feel comfortable speaking to the men. Like the elders testifying before him, he seemed unable to grasp the reality that many don't. Stewart questioned Jackson about disassociation when individuals state they no longer want to be known as a Jehovah's Witness. It's a course of action many abused individuals feel driven to take when their molesters go unpunished and remain in their congregations. The problem is, if you disassociate, you get shunned. So, having been abused, you then lose your entire social network. Jackson rejected the idea that people who no longer wanted to be known as a Jehovah's Witness had to disassociate. He said they could choose to simply become inactive, also known as fading. But Stewart noted that inactive members were still subject to the rules and discipline of the organization. In a moment of staggering disingenuousness, Jackson claimed he'd have to check because it wasn't his field. Stewart persisted, putting it to Jackson that there was no middle road.
What a lying arse. That's all I can say.
Were either a member or you weren't. If you fade, you're still subject to the organization's discipline and rules. Having just claimed it wasn't his field, Jackson now confirmed this was true. Jackson conveniently forgot another fact about inactive witnesses. Even though they're still officially considered Jehovah's Witnesses, in practice, they're often actively avoided and excluded by other witnesses on the grounds that their lack of activity makes them a bad association. Sometimes there's little practical difference between this exclusion and formal shunning. Like the elders who testified before him, Jackson, with his constant evasions and equivocations, exposed himself as a man of no principle, unwilling to state the true doctrines of the organization. And this highlighted a particularly damning hypocrisy. When molesters escape justice on the grounds that neither a second witness or a confession was produced, the organization offers abused individuals the supposed consolation that the matter will be left in Jehovah's hands, the message being that they need to brave the hardships of this earthly life because divine justice will ultimately prevail. But if Jackson had such conviction in ultimate divine justice himself, he'd proclaim his beliefs proudly, braving any earthly hardships that resulted from his faith. Instead, in order to escape earthly criticism, he takes refuge in misrepresenting his religion, while abused individuals are expected to endure their earthly suffering. He is a hypocrite and a coward. In 2017, 18 months after the Commission's Case 29 explored the Jehovah's Witness organization's response to the abuse of BCB and BCG, the Commission initiated Case 54, a follow-up investigation in which Rodney Spinks and Terence O'Brien were called back to report what progress, if any, had been made by the organization. The Commission requested that a governing body member be available in person or by video to give evidence in this important follow-up hearing. The request was denied. Despite the extensive time it was given, the organization had managed to produce just 3 meager documents, including a letter to all elders and a guide for the service desk. Like other procedural documents produced by the organization, the service desk guide was inexplicably classified as strictly confidential, not even for the eyes of the service desk secretaries. The cases of BCB and BCG had highlighted the damage caused by the organization's lack of procedural transparency. But Spinks and O'Brien were unable to explain why congregation members were still being kept from information about processes that governed their lives. A third document had been drafted just 3 days before the Commission hearing. It hadn't been published or distributed, and Stewart spotted some obvious flaws and significant ambiguities in the text. Spinks conceded the wording still needed work, but repeatedly claimed more rigorous practices were now in place. When invited to support that claim with documentation, he admitted he couldn't. So, instead of a public, centralized policy document, the picture remained fragmented. Judge McClellan noted, unless their intentions were clearly reflected in their policy documents, there was a good chance they'd just fall backwards. Predictably, the organization rejected the key findings of the Commission. It continued to demand 2 witnesses. It also rejected the possibility of women having a decision-making role, and it stood by its practice of shunning abused individuals who felt driven to leave the control of their congregations in order to escape their abusers. O'Brien continued to assert that it was their own choice to be shunned. There was a strong element of stagey performance, as he defiantly declared that in regard to the shunning policy, Jehovah was their judge, Jehovah was their lawgiver, Jehovah was their king. The BCB and BCG hearings revealed an organization with its fingers firmly in its ears. To expect change to come from within this secretive, deceptive, controlling organization is, I believe, futile. Energies are much better spent, as BCG suggested, making it financially and criminally accountable for failing the children in its congregations, and, like the work of the Australian Royal Commission, bringing its damaging practices to public attention, exposing abuse.
Well, there you have it. That's the end of the program. I thought the Theramine trees did a fabulous job. And so I have them posted in the description here. Theramine trees also, they have a Patreon account. And if you want to support their efforts and any of their work done here, I also put that link in the description of this live. So one of the other videos I plan on getting permission to show is When Saviors Go Bad. It's a drama and disguised as help. That's one of the ones I plan on showing. And I found myself fitting into some of these roles. For instance, where we, as Jehovah's Witnesses, we used to tell our kids, kind of lay things out for them. We'd lay the whole paradise, the new system. We're used to laying things out for people. And that's part of the indoctrination. That's part of the cult programming that all of us would have had in that organization. So coming out of the organization, how much of that programming is still in our minds, in little things, in day-to-day stuff. So stay tuned for next week, and we will go deeper into some of this. I think it's exciting. I think it's exciting that we are finally getting ourselves free from this cult. And we didn't realize it. None of us realized how deep the indoctrination was. But when you look at the work that the Royal Commission put forth in discoveries of this cult, well, now the whole world knows. And now what's going on in Pennsylvania could very well crumble this organization, because it's not a religion. It does not fit the bill of a religion. In fact, you'll notice all the news articles says the churches. Well, if you go to the Jehovah's Witness Bible, their silver sword, I sometimes call the silver bullet, because after using that, you need a silver bullet. Reading that thing. But anyways, after even their silver bullet tells them that they're doing the wrong thing. But I kind of got off track there. So it's been a late night. So thank you for being with us, sticking with us for these 2 hours. And again, this is important stuff. To me, it's exciting stuff. Let's share it, and let's get this out, and let the Jehovah's Witnesses know what's happening and what's happening within their organization, and how their very leaders are liars. So that's what we're doing. We're just exposing the real truth. So until next time, keep living your life with love. And here we go.
So I can show you that you're perfect. Take you to home where I hit my first lick. Take you around places that I used to go and stomp the ground. Hey now, I wanna take you to my mama's house and show you what she's cooking. Take you to my daddy's house and show you what he's smoking. Take you to my siblings too and show you all the things we do for you. Yeah, now come and ride, baby, come and take a ride. Tell me that you're gonna ride. take a ride, 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 ride. Baby, come and take a ride, 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 ride. Baby, come and take a ride, 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 ride. Come and take a ride with me, ride with me. Hey, I wanna take you down 85, Draco's in the backseat, watching how we bust and have 'em running like a track meet. Take you down 20, ride it racing in the 70 lane. Hey, I wanna take you uptown where places you ain't never been. Take you downtown, cause you know I like to get it in. Paint the town with me and you doing what we do. It's true. Now come and take a ride, 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 ride. Baby, ride, 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 ride. Come and take a ride, 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 ride with me, with me. Now can you ride, 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 ride? Baby, come and take a ride, 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 ride. Come and take a ride, 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 ride. Baby, take a ride, 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 ride. Baby, come and take a ride, 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 ride. Come and ride with me, ride with me. Take a ride, 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 ride. Baby, come and take a ride, 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 ride. Baby, come take a ride, 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 ride. Come and take a ride with me, ride with me, yeah. Ride, ride through the backwoods, through the streets, ride through your neighborhoods with my pigs. Ride, ride.
Thank you.